The cup stood at the far end of the sideboard, apart from the others, which was how she knew. But, she had set the table herself that morning, placing 12 glasses with the same care she had learned in her father's small rectory, each stem turned a quarter-inch to the right, each foot wiped with a clean cloth before it touched the cloth. She knew where each glass sat. She knew that the one at the near end of the sideboard, closest to the door, was the one Gerald had designated for her when guests were present. She knew because he had done it 6 times in the 3 weeks since she had first smelled the compound, and each time he had placed her glass apart from the others, and each time the small ceremony of his filling, it had taken several seconds longer than the filling of the other 11. She was standing at the far side of the dining room when he crossed to the sideboard. She was pretending to examine the arrangement of the eprints she had already examined twice. She heard the clink of the stopper drawn. She heard the brief, particular quiet that meant something other than port was being measured. And then she heard the stopper replaced, the glass lifted, carried. She had 6 seconds to become a woman who did not know. She had become very good, in 3 weeks, at being that woman. Her pulse was steady. This surprised her sometimes, the steadiness of it. She had expected to be afraid, and she was afraid. But the fear had organized itself into something useful, something that looked from the outside like composure, which was perhaps the most Regency quality she possessed. The table was laid for 14. Gerald's mother, Lady Imelda Vane, was seated at his right. Miss Dorothea Bramwell, whom Lady Imelda had once hoped Gerald would marry, was placed 4 seats down, in a gown of champagne silk that made Cecily's pale moss green appear more provincial than it already was. The other guests were Gerald's connections. Men of business, a member of Parliament, a pair of sisters whose father owned mines. None of them knew Cecily well. None of them had thought to know her. She was a vicar's daughter, with a quiet face and a small income, and she had been Gerald Vane's wife for 6 months, and the room had made up its mind about her in the first 5 minutes of the first evening she had appeared in it. She met Gerald's eyes across the table as he set her glass at her place. He smiled. She smiled in return. If you have ever watched someone you trusted become someone you do not recognize, then you already know what Cecily felt in those 14 seconds between his crossing of the room and the seating of the first guest. If you have not, then stay close, because this is a story about the difference between what a woman shows and what a woman knows. The night she had first understood what the compound was, she had stood in the cold of the kitchen passage for a long time, holding the knowledge the way she had once held a wounded bird in her cupped palms in her father's garden. Still, careful, deciding what the next hour required of her, and then the hour after that. Her father had been a vicar in the village of Lowstead in Shropshire for 31 years. He had tended the sick of his parish with more learning than the nearest physician, and a great deal more tenderness, and Cecily had grown up at his elbow, handing him instruments, reading from his medical texts when his eyes failed in the evenings, learning the smell of things. Laudanum had a particular sweetness, a particular heaviness at the back of the throat, like burnt sugar laid over water. She had known it since she was 12. She had known it the moment she lifted her glass at the second supper and registered the compound's presence beneath the port. She had not drunk it. She had set the glass down with a remark about a headache, and Gerald had looked at her across the candles with an expression of such practiced solicitude that she understood in that same moment how long the practice had been running. He had been practicing it since before the marriage began, she thought, possibly since before he had proposed. The solicitude of a man managing an asset he could not afford to damage too quickly. This was the 3rd week. Her father had died in February, quietly, in his own bed, with her hand in his and a candle burning on the nightstand. He had left her the Ashworth settlement, a modest trust administered by a solicitor in the city. A Mr. Demian Aldisker, paying £600 per annum and securing the tenancy of the cottage at Fenwick in Cecily's name until her death or remarriage, whereupon the trust would revert to a charitable foundation for the education of poor clergy children. Gerald had known the terms before he proposed. He had believed, apparently, that the terms would bend in his favor once the marriage was made. He had believed wrong. She had pieced this together from the single conversation she had overheard through the library door in the 4th week of their marriage, when Gerald's solicitor had called. She had stood very still in the corridor and listened to a man recalculate the value of his wife. The solicitor had been apologetic. Gerald had been quiet in the particular way of a man reorganizing his expectations. There had been a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, and then Gerald had said something she could not hear through the door, and the solicitor had responded with the specific, careful tone of a professional declining to agree to something. And then the bell had rung for tea, and she had walked away from the door and washed her face at the basin in her dressing room and looked at herself in the glass for a long time. She had a particular face, the kind that was called composed rather than beautiful, with wide-set gray eyes that tended to see more than people intended her to see, and a composed mouth that she had trained over 24 years to show only what she chose. It had been useful in a rectory. It had become essential in this house. There was a word for what Gerald had in mind, and she had turned it over in her thoughts for 3 weeks, like a stone she was deciding whether to put down or carry. Lady Imelda had introduced herself to Cecily on the first evening of the marriage with the particular warmth of a woman who has already won. She had taken both of Cecily's hands in her white-gloved ones, pressed them, and said, in a voice pitched for Dorothea Bramwell's ear 2 yards away, that Gerald had done a kind thing, marrying a vicar's daughter with provincial notions, and that she hoped Cecily would take London in stride. Words landed with the precision of something practiced. Miss Bramwell had turned to examine a painting. Cecily had thanked Lady Imelda for her welcome, and had taken a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and had thought about her father's bookshelves. She had begun to understand in that first week that the room would not help her. It was in the 3rd week that she had sat down at the small escritoire in the bedroom and written 2 letters. The first to Mr. Rentis, Aldous Kerr, setting out the situation with precision and requesting his attendance at the supper on the 14th of October, which was 3 days hence. The second to Cornelius Harwick, Viscount Harwick, who was her mother's cousin's son, and the only person in London she trusted to act on information without requiring her to justify it. She had not been certain he would come. He had not come easily into her marriage. He had appeared once at a morning call, in the 2nd month, and had stood in the drawing-room with a quality of stillness she had noticed at their introduction, the kind that takes up less room than a man his height should require, and had spoken perhaps 9 words, and had departed. She had thought about those 9 words. For days afterward, he had not come again. She had told herself it was the propriety of his position. A distant relation calling too frequently on a married woman was a subject for commentary. She had told herself this, and had believed it about 3/4 of the way. The letter she had written was 12 lines. She had stated what she had observed, what she had done with the observation, what she required him to arrange. She had not asked him whether it was convenient. She had sealed it, addressed it to his house in Grosvenor Street, and given it to Mrs. Partridge to post. Mrs. Partridge was the housekeeper, 55 years old, who had managed the Vane household through Gerald's father's tenure and had formed her own opinions about Gerald's tenure in silence. She was the one who had brought Cecily the small, dark blue bottle. 3 days after Cecily had asked quietly whether such a vessel could be found. The bottle had been her father's, one of the small, dark glass medicines vessels he had carried as a country vicar to the sick-beds of his parish. She had brought it from the cottage at Fenwick when she married, tucked in the corner of a trunk. She had used it to take the small sample of compound from the cup on the night of the 8th of October, and had sealed it with its original glass stopper, and had placed it inside her left glove in her top drawer. She wore gloves to dinner. That was the Regency custom, and she had always been faithful to custom. The morning of the supper party, she rose at 6 and dressed herself, quietly, without ringing for her maid. She had learned to want solitude in the early hours, before the household assembled its performance. She stood at the east window of the bedroom in her shift and looked at the Georgian street below, the gray stone of the opposite terrace still deep in early shadow, the plane trees along the pavement losing their leaves in the October wind, one at a time, each departure small and complete. Her father had kept a garden. He had grown parsley and sage and rue, and the particular variety of climbing rose that his mother before him had called a tea rose, and that bloomed once in June with such extravagance, and so briefly, that you always felt watching it that you should pay more attention. She had not paid enough attention. She had been 12 and 14 and 19, and busy with his texts and his patients and the rounds of a country parish. And now the garden was overgrown, and he was gone, and she was standing in a townhouse bedroom in London, with a dark blue bottle in her drawer, and it was not grief she felt so much as a specific quality of missing that had no adequate word in any of his texts. She had been a careful student. She had learned to make decisions from what was true rather than from what she wished were true. It was the thing he had taught her more thoroughly than any other, and she intended to honor it. Lady Imelda arrived at 10 to help Cecily dress, which Cecily had not requested, and which Lady Imelda had made sound like a gift. They sat together in the bedroom while Lady Imelda offered observations on the apparel, the menu, and the guest list, and at the end of it she had turned to Cecily with a small measured smile and said that she hoped Cecily was managing, that these large dinners were a great deal for a girl of her upbringing, that a vicar's daughter with provincial notions could not be expected to take to them easily, only that Gerald had chosen this life, and one did adjust. Mrs. Partridge appeared in the doorway a moment later, ostensibly to ask about the fish course, and caught Cecily's eye. And when Lady Imelda had descended to the dining room, she stepped into the bedroom and said in the voice of someone reporting the weather, that Lady Imelda had said much the same thing in the front hall an hour ago, to the footman who had opened the door, that her son had made a well-meant mistake with the vicar's daughter, that provincial notions were difficult to shake. She said it 3 times in the hall, Mrs. Partridge said. I counted. Cecily looked at the blue bottle in her left glove in her top drawer. Thank you, Mrs. Partridge, she said. Will you see that Mr. Kerr's coat is taken when he arrives? He is expected at 7:30, and Lord Harwick, if he comes. He'll come, Mrs. Partridge said. She said it with the certainty of someone who had read Cecily's letter over the copying, which Cecily had permitted because Mrs. Ray. Partridge was a witness, and witnesses needed to know what they were witnessing. She said it also with the specific certainty of a woman who had watched a man's face in a drawing room 8 weeks ago, and had drawn her own conclusions about the 9 words he had spoken and the length of time he had stood at the door before departing. Cornelius arrived in the front hall at 7:25, alone, without the social excuse of a wife or companion, and placed his hat with the footman, with the efficiency of a man who had decided something and did not intend to take it back. He stood in the hall for 1 moment and then looked up and found Cecily on the landing above, in the moss-green gown with the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and held her gaze for a count of 4 seconds. She descended the stairs. He extended his hand, and she gave him hers, and he said, Mrs. Vane. And she said, Lord Harwick, and that was the full extent of it. He looked at Gerald. He looked at Gerald the way a man looks at something he is cataloguing for later use, and Gerald smiled, and extended his hand, and made the expected remarks about gratitude for the honor of a viscount's company, and Cornelius said 3 words and turned to examine the portrait in the hall, which was Gerald's father, and bore no resemblance to Gerald in any way that mattered. They did not speak privately until near 11 in the library, after the 3rd course had been cleared and the port had circulated. Cecily had excused herself to see to the dessert arrangement, which required no seeing to and which everyone present understood to be the thing a woman says when she needs 3 minutes in a room without her husband. She stood at the library window looking at the dark plane trees in the street below, with the blue bottle inside her left glove. The fire had been lit against the October chill, and it threw a warm, uncertain light across the floor and up the bookshelves, and the shadows of the books moved in it, and she thought about her father's library in Lowstead, how she had spent the evenings of her girlhood inside it. Like the most companionable silence available, she heard the door open. She did not turn. Is it enough? Said Cornelius behind her. It was not a question precisely. It was the kind of statement that has a question inside it. She turned. He was standing just inside the door, not far in, as if he had decided to respect the distance she had not asked him to respect. She could see the faint scar at his left cheekbone in the candlelight, and the quality of patient attention in his dark eyes, and the particular stillness that had always made her feel in his presence. That time was not quite so urgent as she had believed. "It is enough," she said. "Mr. Kerr has it. The documentation of the settlement terms, the proof of Gerald's belief about the trust. Mrs. Partridge will speak to what she has seen at the sideboard, and I have the blue bottle." "I brought a man from the magistrate's office," he said. She had not asked him for that. She had asked only for Mr. Kerr, and for the arrangement of the room. She looked at him. "You were not certain I could manage it," she said. "I was certain you could," he said, his voice low. "I was not certain it was enough to manage it quietly. There is a distance between exposure and consequence. I wish to close it." She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. "You received my letter the day I sent it," she said 2 hours after. "And it took you 6 days to arrange what I needed." "It took me 6 days to arrange what you needed," he said. "And 3 days before that to explain to myself why I had not come in August or September." She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with the same patient attention that had been disconcerting at the morning call in August, the quality of a man who does not look away from difficult things, who has perhaps paid a high price for that quality, and considers it worth paying again. She understood then something she had suspected since August. She understood that this was what he had been doing for 5 years since his first wife's death, finding the distance between witnessing harm and preventing it, trying to close it, failing, trying again. She had heard something of Margaret Harwick, dead 3 years past. She had heard the bare fact of it, a marriage made quickly, under family pressure, a childbed death, a lord who had declined every society engagement for 18 months afterward, and had returned to London a different quality of quiet than he had left it. She had not heard more. She did not ask. Then she asked with a look, and he answered it, with a stillness that lasted 4 seconds and said everything that months of restraint had accumulated. The fire shifted again. Outside in the dining room she could hear the low, particular sound of 14 people performing sociability. "He will try to leave the room," she said. "The doors are attended," Cornelius said. "Mr. Kerr is at his seat. The man from the magistrate's office is at the near wall." She nodded. She reached into her left glove and showed him the blue bottle. He looked at it for a long time and did not touch it, because he understood that the bottle was hers and that she had decided what to do with it. She put it back. She smoothed her glove. She looked at the fire for another moment and thought about her father's voice reading a medical text aloud in the study at Lowstead, the particular cadence of it, how he read with the same care, whether the text was about compounds or psalms, as if precision itself were a form of devotion. She said, "I know what I am going to say." He said, "I know." They returned to the table. Gerald watched Cecily take her seat. He watched her reach for the glass he had placed at her setting, the glass set apart from the others, and he watched her not lift it, and his gaze moved to her face for 2 seconds in the calculation she had learned to recognize now as easily as she recognized the smell of burnt sugar beneath port. His eyes were the color of pale winter sky, pleasant and opaque, and they moved over her face the way a man reads a letter for the number at the bottom, skipping everything else. She met his eyes. She smiled. Lady Imelda was holding a conversation, at the far end of the table, about the merits of sea-bathing at Brighton. Miss Bramwell was listening with the polished attention of a woman who has spent her life listening to women in positions she intended to occupy. Mr. Kerr, seated between the Member of Parliament and one of the mining sisters, was examining his dessert with the focused quiet of a man awaiting a cue and too experienced to do it visibly. The candles burned. The silver caught the light. A footman refilled the port decanter. Gerald said something to his neighbor about the harvest which had been poor, and the neighbor agreed. And someone at the far end laughed at something Lady Imelda had said, and the mahogany table held the evening together the way such tables hold such evenings, by containing everything within its gleaming surface and reflecting it back, as civility. Cecily reached into the hem of her glove and held the blue bottle in her fingers, beneath the edge of the table. Her father had told her once, sitting in his study while she read him the 3rd chapter of a medical treatise he was using for a sermon, that the act of speaking a true thing into a room that has decided to believe a false one is not courage in the theatrical sense. It is simply an act of attention. You attend to what is true, he had said. You say it. You let the room arrange itself around the truth rather than the other way. She had been 14. She had thought about it for 10 years. She rose from her chair. It was not a loud motion. She simply stood as one stands when one has something to say, the blue bottle in her right hand, the glove removed, the glass at her setting, exactly where Gerald had placed it, apart from the others, full of the thing that was not port. Gerald looked at her. The easy smile was already assembling itself on his face. He had spent a long time assembling that smile. "My dear," she said, and her voice carried the length of the table without any particular effort, the way her father's voice had always carried in the nave of the church in Lowstead. "Before the port is finished, I think we ought to speak to the matter of this cup." The table stilled. Lady Imelda's fan paused at its apex. Miss Bramwell's gaze went from Cecily to Gerald and back. Gerald's smile held. "Cecily," he said, with the precise warmth of a man managing a scene he does not expect to lose. "Sit down, my love. This is not the moment for whatever it is." She looked at him. She looked at him for the length of a full breath, during which no one at the table moved. "I have watched you fill that cup, Gerald," she said. 3 weeks. She set the blue bottle at the center of the table. Mr. Kerr rose from his chair. Gerald's smile collapsed. Not all at once. It went piece by piece the way a plaster wall goes, when the foundation beneath it settles, a crack, then the weight of the crack, then the inevitable surrender of the surface to what had been happening underneath for far longer than anyone looking at the surface could have known. "This is a sample of the compound you have introduced into my glass since the 22nd of September, Cecily said. "I recognized it at the second supper. My father was a country vicar who kept medical texts and taught me their contents. I have preserved the sample in this vessel in the expectation of making it available to Mr. Kerr, who is the solicitor to my late father's estate, and who arrived this evening, at my invitation." "And I," said a man near the door who had been introduced as a friend of Lord Harwick's and whose presence Gerald had accepted without particular scrutiny, "am here at Lord Harwick's arrangement, in a professional capacity, to hear Mrs. Vane's account and take custody of the evidence." He produced a small card and placed it on the sideboard beside the glass. Lady Imelda looked at the card. She set her fan on the table. The click of it was the loudest sound in the room. Mrs. Partridge appeared in the doorway behind a footman, as Cecily had arranged. She stood with her hands folded in front of her apron, and looked at Gerald with the expression of a woman who had made up her mind several weeks ago, and had been waiting patiently for the room to catch up. Gerald looked at Cecily. He looked at her with the particular quality of a man who is searching, still, for the version of events in which he comes out of this well, in which what he has built over 6 months can be preserved or negotiated. She had known, in the kitchen passage 3 weeks ago, that he would look at her this way when the moment came. She had stood in the cold and anticipated it, and now that it was here, it was exactly as she had expected, and she felt no particular triumph in the accuracy of her expectation, only the clear, flat certainty of a thing attended to and seen. "Ras," she said, "I am going to Fenwick. I should be grateful if you would make no effort to follow." She had not planned the line. It arrived as her father's sentences had always arrived, from a place below planning where true things assembled themselves without the distortion of calculation. Gerald heard it. The room heard it. Lady Imelda heard it and looked at her son, and then at the blue bottle at the center of the table, and the expression that crossed her face was not a simple one. It was the expression of a woman who had spent a lifetime being certain of her son, and who was now performing in public the rapid arithmetic of what certainty had cost her. The confidence that had always been so complete, so assured, had been built on a foundation she had not examined. She was examining it now, in front of 14 people with the particular quality of public reckoning that offers no private grace. "Gerald," Lady Imelda said one word. She did not say another. The room arranged itself, as rooms do when a truth has been spoken into them. Cornelius did not cross the room in 3 strides. He had been seated near the center of the table, and he rose quietly and came to stand at Cecily's left and did nothing more than stand there, which was precisely correct. The magistrate's man was speaking to Gerald in a low voice. "Mr. Miskin." Kerr had produced a document from the case at his feet and placed it on the table. Miss Bramwell had turned to examine the middle distance with the expression of a woman memorizing details for later, which she would use to considerable effect in drawing rooms throughout the following weeks, in the way that useful witnesses always do. End quote. The supper dissolved. It went the way things go when the thing holding them together has been removed. Not violently, not in a single collapse, but in a gradual redistribution, the guests toward their coats and carriages, each of them finding reasons to press Cecily's hand or not press it. The mining sisters lingered longer than necessary, which told Cecily something about mining sisters that she stored away for later. Lady Imelda was the last to leave. She stood at the door of the dining room with her gloves in her hands, unlaced, which was the first time Cecily had seen her with anything unlaced. She looked at Cecily for a long moment. She did not apologize. She was not, at her age and in her position, a woman who apologized with ease. She said instead, "I did not know," which Cecily believed, because Lady Imelda's confidence had always been the confidence of ignorance, and ignorance could not apologize for what it had not known it was protecting. "I believe you," Cecily said. Lady Imelda put on her gloves. She departed. The fan remained on the table. Cornelius stayed. He stood in the drawing room while the footman cleared the dining room, and Cecily came to sit in the chair nearest the fire, and Mrs. Hell. Partridge brought tea without being asked, and set it between them, and withdrew without commentary, because she had the gift of knowing when commentary was not the thing required. The fire settled. Outside the Georgian windows, the October street was quiet. Cecily poured. She poured for both of them, the way she had poured in her father's study in the evenings when they had finished reading. Cornelius sat across from her, his coat still on against the chill that the fire had not yet managed, and he held the cup in both hands the way a man holds something he is not certain he deserves, with care. "You will go to Fenwick," he said in the morning. She looked at the fire. "The magistrate's proceedings will require Mr. Kerr and Mrs. Partridge, not me. There is nothing I could add that I have not already provided." He was quiet. "Then," he said, "Margaret?" She waited. "She did not wish to marry me," he said. "She was pressed by her family. I knew it, or I suspected it, and I told myself that affection would come with time, because that is what one tells oneself when one very much wants a particular thing. She died in childbed in the 2nd year. She died, I have always believed, resenting the life she had been given, and I was the life she had been given." He set down the cup. "I kept my distance from you because I did not trust that my proximity to a woman in a constrained situation was anything other than additional constraint. And now," she said, "and now I have had 3 days to think about it since your letter arrived," he said, "and the conclusion I have reached is that keeping my distance while you were in that house was not restraint. It was a different kind of failure dressed in the same clothes." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same patient attention that had been unsettling since August, the quality of a man who will not look away, who has decided that looking away is the one thing he will not do again. "Will you call," she said, "when I am settled at Fenwick?" He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the fire shifted and the shadows on the bookshelves moved and the tea cooled, another degree between them. "Yes," he said. It was not a declaration. It was a decision. She had learned in 6 months of a man's declarations to prefer decisions made quietly, by firelight, with no audience. She went to Fenwick the following morning, in a hired chaise, with Mrs. Burr. partridge, and 2 trunks, and the small dark blue bottle wrapped in a cloth and placed carefully in the corner of the second trunk. The cottage was stone-built and small, with a kitchen garden that had overgrown in her father's last months, and a parlor with bookshelves still carrying his library, and a window that faced east. And in the mornings, when the light came through that window, it came exactly as it had come through the study window in Lowstead, the same angle, the same quality of autumn gold that did not have any name in any of the medical texts, but that she had always thought of, privately, as the color of surviving. The magistrate's proceedings were set in motion by Mr. D. Kerr, who wrote to her at the cottage within the week, with a progress report composed in the measured prose of a man who had seen situations of this kind before and had always believed the settlements would hold if the person they protected had the clarity to use them. The social consequence, he noted in a subordinate clause near the end, appeared to be proceeding of its own accord, which was how social consequence tended to proceed, once it had been given sufficient material. Gerald did not follow. Gerald had other and more pressing engagements with the gentleman from the magistrate's office, and then with his own solicitor, and then with a series of quiet conversations with persons of standing who had attended the supper on the 14th and had formed their own opinions about what they had witnessed. The silence that the London season extended toward him was not dramatic. It was the specific silence of a community, deciding that a man is no longer to be received, which operates through 100 small omissions over many weeks, and is in its own way more thorough than any louder reckoning. Cecily spent the first fortnight of her return to Fenwick doing the thing she had been unable to do in London. She sat in her father's chair, in the parlor, where his books still stood in the order he had always kept them, and she cried once for a long time, with the particular quality of grief that had been waiting patiently in the kitchen passage, and the bedroom and the dining room for 3 weeks, and now finally had a room in which it was permitted. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to see what the kitchen garden needed. It needed a great deal. She worked in the mornings, when the autumn light was long and the ground still workable. And in the afternoons, she read. And in the evenings, she wrote to Mr. D. Kerr, and sometimes she sat in the east window and watched the light leave the garden, and thought about a man who had stood at a library door, and said, "Is it enough?" and had meant, she thought, several things at once. In the 3rd week of November, Cornelius arrived in a curricle, alone, without announcement. She came to the kitchen garden door when she heard the wheels on the gravel and found him standing in the garden looking at the overgrown state of it, with his hands clasped behind him and his hat in one of them, with the quality of a man assessing a situation and deciding where to begin. He turned when she appeared in the doorway, and she saw the faint scar at his left cheekbone catch the pale autumn light, and the dark eyes with their particular attention, and the navy tailcoat against the gray November sky, and the single signet ring on his right hand, which was the only adornment he ever wore. She said, "The parsley is entirely beyond managing." He said, "I can manage parsley." She looked at him, the particulars of him, the stillness that took up less room than it should, the way he stood in the overgrown kitchen garden as he had stood in the drawing room and the library and the dining room, precisely, with care, as if the space around him were something worth respecting. He said, "I should like Mrs. Vane, if I may, to ask whether the cottage requires a great deal of maintenance over the winter. I find myself at liberty. And I know something about kitchen gardens, which is an unusual qualification to have, but it appears to be the one you need at present." She felt the quality that was not quite amusement, and not quite tenderness, and had no adequate name in any of her father's texts. She said, "I imagine there will be a great deal to discuss, if you call frequently enough." He came inside. She put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table with his coat still on, because the cottage was cold in November and she had not yet managed the range to any reliable standard, and she set a cup in front of him without asking whether he wanted it, because the answer was clear and she had spent enough months in a house where the clear thing was never named. He wrapped both hands around the cup. His hands were large and still the same quality of stillness as the rest of him, and the signet ring caught the kitchen light. She sat across from him. They were perhaps 3 feet apart. which in a London drawing room is a social distance and in a kitchen in November is something else. She said, "I thought about the letter for 2 days before I sent it." "I thought about replying for 2 days before I came," he said. "What decided you?" He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the blue bottle in the library for a long time without speaking, with the quality of attention that asks a question by simply being present, that says what it cannot yet say through the sustained fact of its attention. "You," he said. "The letter was 12 lines. You used 7 of them to describe the situation with precision, and 5 of them to describe what you needed arranged. Not to ask me whether I would. To describe what needed arranging as if my willingness could be assumed." He paused. "I thought about that for 2 days." She understood what he was saying, and it was the most Regency thing that had happened to her since the marriage began, which was that the thing being said was nothing like the words being used to say it. He was saying that she had trusted him, and that being trusted by her specifically had undone the 5-year calculus of his self-imposed distance. She said, "I did assume it." "I know," he said. The kettle had been boiling for some time. She rose and poured and returned to the table and set her own cup between her hands. Outside the window, the kitchen garden stood in its overgrown state, against the pale November sky, the parsley gone to seed, the sage sprawling over the path, the climbing rose at the far wall bare of everything except the architecture of itself, all its thorns and structure visible now that the leaves were gone. The form that had been there all along underneath the season's green abundance. He looked at the garden through the window. Then he looked at her. "Next spring," he said, "the rose will be worth managing." She understood this to be about the rose. She understood it also to be about the spring. She understood it most precisely to be about the distance between this November and that spring, and what the two of them might do with it. "Yes," she said, "I believe it will." They sat in the kitchen while the afternoon light shortened outside the east window, and the fire in the range found its rhythm at last, and the cups warmed their hands. They did not rush the silence. There had been enough rushing, in enough rooms for several years now, and this kitchen was not interested in rushing. On the windowsill above the basin, in the spot where her father had kept his oil lamp, the small dark blue bottle stood with its glass stopper fitted precisely in place. The afternoon light came through it and cast a small, specific shadow on the wall no longer than 2 fingers. The shadow was the exact shape of a thing that has served its purpose and been set down by a woman who knew, when she picked it up, what she was doing, and knew when she set it down that it was done. She had stopped counting weeks. She had begun counting mornings. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's composure moved you, leave a thought in the comments. We read every one. Until the next story,